Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Auburn City Council study session for May 24th, 2021. And we will call this meeting to order. And per Governor Inslee's emergency proclamation 20-05 and 20-28, and stay safe, stay healthy, the City of Auburn is prohibited from holding in-person meetings at this time. City of Auburn Resolution 5581 designates the City of Auburn meeting locations for our regular, special, and study session meetings of the City Council and all committees, boards, and commissions of the city as virtual locations until Washington's governor authorizes local governments to conduct in-person meetings. Sean, will you please call the roll?
Deputy Mayor DeCoursey.
Here.
Councilmember Baggett.
Here.
Councilmember Brown.
Here.
Councilmember J-Raj.
I'm here.
Councilmember Malenga.
Here.
Councilmember Stearns.
Here.
Councilmember Trott-Manuel.
Here.
Okay, thank you. Any announcements, reports, or presentations?
Yes, Your Honor. There has been an updated version of Ordinance 6822 provided to Council prior to the meeting.
Great, thank you. All right, Council, we will move into our agenda items for Council discussion this evening. And the first item on the agenda is our Housing Action Plan, known as HAP. A briefing with Director Tate.
Well, thank you, and good evening, Deputy Mayor, Council, and Mayor. So this evening, the first item on the agenda is the Housing Action Plan. I'm actually going to turn it over to Jeff Dixon, who's the Planning Services Manager for the Department of Community Development. I do want to say just quickly before turning this over, typically you'd find this on the special focus area agenda for the community wellness special focus area. But because we have a consultant who is presenting this evening, and to ensure that we're controlling our costs and being respectful of their time, we put this on the regular agenda so that it could go first. So with that said, I will turn it over to Jeff Dixon. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, Jeff Dixon, Planning Services Manager. The topic for discussion this evening, as Jeff mentioned, is the public draft of the Housing Action Plan. As you may recall, in 2019, the Washington State Legislature passed House Bill 1923, which provided a series of grant funding for jurisdictions to develop housing actions plans. City of Auburn applied for and was successful in receiving one of those grants, and the City Council authorized a contract with the Washington State Department of Commerce for the preparation of that Housing Action Plan by Resolution 5417. So the goal of a Housing Action Plan is to encourage the addition of affordable and market rate housing in a greater variety and at prices available to a greater variety of incomes. As you may recall from your February 22nd study session, at that meeting, we had the city's consultant, Tyler Bump of Eco Northwest, provide an introductory discussion on their findings of the housing conditions affecting and influencing this housing supply in the city of Auburn. They specifically spoke to the housing needs assessment, what was the needs of the supply in Auburn, to talk about the market conditions in the circumstances of Auburn, and to review the city's existing policies in our comprehensive plan, and then to report on the methodology of analysis that they were using to approach that. Throughout this effort, the city has been conducting public outreach largely through multiple methods, but one of the main ones that we've been using is the city's website. It is interactive in that it provides some information and links, but it can also be used to provide public comment and to provide feedback through that portal. City has also used individual stakeholder interviews, small group interviews, and community forums, most recently on May 12th and May 17th. And you may hear a little bit more about those in just a moment. On May 10th, so just recently, the city issued a public draft of this housing action plan, and will observe a public comment period up through June 1st. This document contains a series of recommendations that have been specifically tailored to the setting and circumstances in Auburn, and you will hear more about those recommendations by the next speaker in just a moment. So with that, I will jump ahead a little bit to discuss a little about the next steps. So after the close of the public comment period, staff will use this information to refine the draft of the housing action plan and to prepare a final draft with the consultant's help. And this draft will contain a series of recommendations that the city can prioritize and choose from and to implement over the coming years. Some of the actions may require changes to the city's comprehensive plan, development of code sections, and other efforts that may take a period of time or even years to implement. The grant requirements do prescribe that the housing action plan must be adopted by the City Council, and this is tentatively scheduled for July 6th. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to introduce Tyler Bump, Director of Urban Services for Eco Northwest, who has been assisting the city with the preparation of this housing action plan.
All right, thank you, Jeff. And good evening, Mayor Backus, Deputy Mayor DeCourcy, members of the council. My name is Tyler Bump. As Jeff mentioned, I'm from a consulting firm called Eco Northwest. Can everybody hear me okay before I get moving? We okay? All right. I'm going to go over a PowerPoint presentation that we have for you today in just a moment. If you'll bear with me while I share my screen real quick, please. Okay. Can everybody see that title page all right? All right. Okay, we'll get moving from here. First, I want to give a quick project overview. Jeff provided some context here for what we've been up to, and I talked to you all, as Jeff mentioned, I don't know, it's 3 months ago, 4 months ago or so, when we went over the sort of key findings of the existing conditions and the housing needs assessment. Before I get in, I do want to give a big shout out and thanks again to city staff here, Jeff Tate, Jeff Dixon, Alexandria Teague, and a number of other staff that have helped with the engagement efforts. It's been great working with everybody, and it's been a fun project. So a little bit about the process here, and I shared this slide with you last time as well. We've got really 4 main steps of this project that we've been working on. The first is public engagement. That we've been working on throughout the duration of the project. We had a public engagement plan and then executed on that public engagement plan. And as Jeff mentioned, we just had the community forums over the last week and a half or so. And those were very productive and helpful, good conversation there on some of the recommendations and really the trade-offs of some of the recommendations that will incorporate that feedback into the final housing action plan. The second piece is the existing conditions report, which includes a lot of information. I think you all looked at before, about 80 pages of documentation on demographics and housing trends and development trends that have really informed the recommendations here as well. And then we've got this recommendations portion, and this is what the new content for you all today. The recommendations that we have in the housing action plan come from really 5 key things. One is the existing conditions and the data, public input through the engagement process, staff input, talking to a number of staff across different offices in the city of Auburn, an evaluation of development feasibility. So we've actually tested these recommendations to see how effective they would be in advancing different housing options or creating more housing opportunities for folks across Auburn. And then the other is prioritizing these actions. The final step of the housing action plan will be adoption. So you all will at some point in the near future adopt a report, which is the final housing action plan. I'll talk a little bit around the implementation and what that means for you all at the end of the presentation. A little bit more background. We did sort of build off of some work we had done with a broader coalition of cities as part of the South King County Subregional Housing Action Plan framework. Auburn is one of the cities. I'll show a map in a moment of the cities that were part of that group. But again, in this project, we've got sort of these key pieces: public engagement, demographic analysis. One of the really key things in looking at future housing need is a population forecasts and identifying housing needed through 2040. And then these categories of strategies. So we've got 4 key objectives or categories here. One is encouraging market rate development in downtown Auburn Center downtown Auburn and the urban center. The second is encouraging the development of below market rate housing in downtown Auburn. Encourage the development of middle housing in single dwelling zones. I'll talk about that, what that means as well. And then really thinking intentionally about preventing or mitigating for displacement and encouraging the preservation of existing affordable housing. And then the final step that we're doing here is the final housing action plan. So a quick note on the South King County Subregional Housing Action Plan. Was a really great project to work on, and really pretty amazing to see the 6 jurisdictions here: Federal Way, Auburn, Kent, Renton, Tukwila, and Burien, sort of working together collaboratively, understanding that the decisions that are made within the boundaries of a city impact the broader South King County housing market. And so really thinking cohesively as a whole in South King County about housing policy and decisions in moving housing forward in the future in South King County. I'm going to give a quick overview again of some of these housing needs assessment findings and existing conditions to sort of set the stage for some of the recommendations. You've seen a lot more than this before in the previous presentation, so consider this a little bit of the greatest hits of our housing needs assessment. There's a lot of conversation in our recommendations in the Housing Action Plan around AMI or MFI. So AMI means area median income, MFI means median family income. And sometimes we use those things, and folks in housing policy use those terms interchangeably. But in general, it's a way to talk about housing affordability across different household sizes and household types. And it's a definition that is used by HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And AMI is defined at the county level. And so I want to show as an example of how we think about AMI throughout this report and what it means for the recommendations. I'll point to this 80% AMI category here. And looking at a family of a household size of 2 or family size of 2. So 80% of AMI means 80% of area median income. And what that means in terms of annual income for a 2-person household at 80% AMI is that household earns up to $64,200 per year. And we can afford, in terms of what we call affordability of 30% threshold, $1,605 per month in monthly housing costs. And that is defined using 30% of a household's monthly income going towards housing costs. If a household spends more than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs, that household is considered cost burdened if they spend more than 30% of their household income. So again, 80%, about $1,600 a month for a family of 2 or a household of 2. And for a 4-person household, just again as an example, that same 80% level, the annual income for a 4-person household goes up a little above $80,000 a year, which translates to about a little over $2,000 a month in monthly housing costs to not be cost burdened. So again, that 30% threshold. But just a little bit of discussion around AMI and MFI and what that means when we use those things throughout the report and the presentation. So building off of that, this is one of our key takeaways that I shared with you in the last presentation I want to revisit tonight. We look at Auburn in the green bars, South King County in the blue bars, and King County in the gray bars as a way to compare the household income or the composition of different households across the city, South King County, and King County as a whole. And one of the key findings that we found here for Auburn specifically is that Auburn really does mirror some of the trends or the household composition of South King County as a whole compared to King County. And what that means is that Auburn has a lower share of higher income households, so households that earn 100% or above of area median income for the county, but has a higher share of households in the 50 to 80% AMI category. And really that 50 to 80% AMI category is often called workforce housing or middle income households. So really sort of moderate income households throughout the region. There's a lot more folks in Auburn and South King County than King County as a whole. And part of that reflects the housing affordability in Auburn compared to other parts of King County, East King County, City of Seattle, other more costly markets in King County as well. One of the other key trends or key findings that we have here is changes in housing affordability. So we looked from 2010 to 2020 and found about a 49% increase in the average 2-bedroom rent in Auburn in that 10-year period of time. We also identified or found an 88% increase in the median home sales price in that same 10-year period. So home sale prices have gone up 88% in that 10-year period. We also try to look at changes in household income over that period of time to see how changes in housing prices relate to household income. And so what we found is that for renter household incomes have increased by 46% from 2012 to 2018, a little different year because of the data sources here. But what that means when we look at this data is two things are possible and likely. One is that Auburn residents could potentially be accessing higher paying jobs throughout the region. But it also could mean that there's higher income renters that are moving into Auburn in this period of time as well. And both of those things are likely happening in Auburn that are impacting the rental market specifically. The second point here on household incomes is that while there's been an 88% increase in the price of, or in median home sales prices, there's been only a 17% increase in the median owner household income. So for homeowners, housing costs have gone up a lot more than the incomes of homeowner households in that period of time. And then sort of to revisit the cost burdening concept. So again, households that spend more than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs are identified as cost burden. And then households that spend more than 50% of their monthly income on housing costs is what we call severely cost burden. And what we found here looking into the data in Auburn is that 53% of renters across the city are cost burdened, and about 27% of renters across Auburn are severely cost burdened. So one of the things when we think about housing affordability and housing needs is current population, current households, and thinking about affordability for those folks, as well as folks that will be moving to Auburn over the next 20 years as well. One of the other things that we've looked at is development trends over time. So we looked at annual housing production in the city of Auburn from 2011 through 2019 and found that on average, Auburn saw about 390 new units of housing built on an annual basis between 2011 and 2019, with 2013 and 2019 being the big years for new housing units built in the city. And that's really important when we think about the forecast housing need through 2040. And so what we've done is we've taken the King County 2040 growth targets, and these are currently being updated, and King County will have new growth targets pretty soon. But with the currently adopted 2040 growth targets, we've identified a housing need of about 10,429 new units needed in Auburn by 2040. And that works out to about 521 units a year. And Auburn's seen about 390 units a year built over the last 9 years or so. So in order for Auburn to keep up with population growth and housing pressures, you all will need to see increases in housing production to meet that need. One of the questions that we often get is, why do we need to have this much housing built when there's this much population coming in? And I always like to mention that without enough housing, the folks at the lower end of the income spectrum are generally those that have less options and less choices when housing gets more expensive. So if there's not enough housing built for the folks that are moving here, it does tend to cause price increases that mostly impact lower income households to be able to stay and to live in Auburn. So just a bigger policy framework for the need for additional housing here as well. We've looked at the breakdown of that 10,000 or so units needed, 10,400 units needed by 2040 by income level as well. And these broadly pretty much match the existing household income distribution in Auburn, but a large amount of units needed in the 100% AMI category and above, as well as a good chunk of units needed in the below 80% AMI category as well. The lower income household categories are really a tough nut to crack, because those are household incomes that generally will need some level of public subsidy or incentive to be able to build housing that's affordable to those lower income households. I want to give a quick update. Jeff gave a little bit intro on our public engagement efforts to date, and I do want to sort of mention a lot of the work that our partners on this project from Broadview Planning, Andrea Petzel from Broadview Planning and her team have been doing. So as Jeff mentioned, there's a city website with a lot of materials and opportunities from public engagement, which has been really great, especially during COVID. Additionally, we've had 13 interviews with different folks throughout the community. We've held 2 focus groups. Jeff mentioned the 2 community forums that have happened over the last week and a half. And we've done a couple of stakeholder or targeted stakeholder presentations as well. Most recently, I gave a presentation to the Master Builders Association of King and Snohomish counties last week to give them an overview of some of these draft recommendations as well. So a lot of public engagement, a lot of stakeholder engagement we've been doing as well. And so I'm going to jump in now into the recommendation section of the report. And this is really most of the new content for you all and really the meaningful results of all the work that we've done so far. I have our specific recommendations broken down into each of those categories that I provided an overview at the beginning of the presentation. The first objective or category that we're looking at is encouraging market rate development downtown. In some of these charts you'll see, or in some of these slides, you'll see these examples of how we've done some development feasibility testing. I'm not going to go too far into the weeds on what these charts mean, but the recommendations that we do have are support more feasible housing production. So one of the things we've been looking at is to make sure that these recommendations again are meaningful and can achieve the housing outcomes that you all are looking for or need to achieve to meet population growth. So the first recommendation that we have in this category for encouraging market rate development downtown is to consider reducing parking requirements to 0.8 spaces per unit from the 1 space per unit requirement that's in downtown Auburn today. The current 1 space per unit requirement is a special parking requirement specific to the DUC zone or the downtown urban center zone. So it's already a bit lower because of its adjacency to transit and the vision for the downtown urban center. But we do find some opportunities to reduce the parking requirements and sort of think about the efficiency of buildings that are allowed downtown. And so it's a way to really maximize the parking that's available, what we call in 1 tray of parking. So 1 level of surface parking, as opposed to having weird multiple levels of surface parking to support development downtown. Along with that, we have a recommendation to consider offering a density bonus to support, again, higher density and mixed income housing in the downtown urban center. Another moderate recommendation to increase density from 3.5 floor area ratio to 4.31 to 1 floor area ratio. And really that density bonus is a way to backfill the space that was lost from parking with more housing units that fit within the height limitations and the development standards within the downtown urban center standards today. A couple more recommendations. We've done some thinking on promoting lot aggregation. One of the key things to think about here is sort of supporting or allowing shared and pooled parking between developments and different uses. There's currently some allowances in city code. There might be some opportunities to improve those, to think about shared parking downtown in a little bit different way. And then we have another recommendation to explore fee waivers for targeted development types. And that could be specific types of development, like this larger density or higher density mixed use development in the picture here, or it could be specific to affordable housing or affordable units within a mixed income project. One of the specific recommendations that we have is to evaluate partial fee waivers up to 80% that does not require local funding to backfill the exempted portion of the fee. And that's consistent with recent state legislative changes. So that's brand new. We have a recommendation in there to explore that a little bit. Some of these recommendations do have fiscal impacts, honestly. And so it's really important to think about the recommendations of the fee waivers relative to the city budget and the fiscal impacts and service provision and all those things that you all as city council think about. The next objective or category that we have here is encouraging affordable housing downtown. So we've got one broad category of creating policies to lower the cost of affordable housing. Consider what specific recommendations to consider an expedited permitting process specific for affordable housing and mixed income housing. Consider reducing permit costs specific to nonprofit affordable housing developers. And then another one is to continue to support SCIP, which is the South King County Housing and Homelessness Partnerships Housing Capital Fund, through allocating of SHB 1406 funds as well. So continuing Auburn's work in support of the South King County Housing and Homelessness Partnership. Another recommendation that we have here is consider a voluntary inclusionary housing program that's paired with a development bonus or a financial incentive. And so this would be a voluntary affordability requirement that would be paired with a tax exemption or with a density bonus. We've tested out a couple different things just to provide some context for the impacts to development feasibility for each of these. Again, the tax exemption is foregone tax revenues for a 12-year period of time is what we looked at here. So there is fiscal implications there, but those tax revenues do come back at some point in time. But we just had to pick something to sort of evaluate to test here to think about tax exemptions relative to affordability. We did also look at inclusionary requirements without financial incentives. So affordability requirements and essentially a mandatory inclusionary zoning program without financial incentives. And we found that it's not feasible and reduces development feasibility pretty substantially without financial incentives. One of the other things that we've looked at that's kind of unique to a certain development type is reducing parking requirements for micro units. Micro units are a development type that oftentimes can be called, sort of new. They're kind of like newer SROs, newer single room occupancy, but efficiency units. So smaller studio units, maybe with kitchens in them or shared bathrooms, or maybe a small water closet, but really smaller efficiency units. We found that micro units can be affordable to single person households at 60% MFI and below with no public subsidy. Again, these are housing types that aren't going to work for the broad range of household needs in Auburn, but for single person households, it is a way to think about affordability and access to housing at a lower price point without public subsidy or incentives. Auburn could reduce the parking requirements in exchange for affordability requirements. So exchanging the parking requirements, reducing parking requirements in exchange for affordability. But you might want to consider and might need to monitor and regulate the parking impacts if Auburn decides to go this way as well. We have some recommendations in the housing action plan itself. We found that you would pretty much want to think about targeting 0.3 parking spaces per unit, maybe 0.4 parking spaces per unit to really make micro housing units work. I should note that there already is a planned micro unit development in downtown Auburn right now. And so we've started kind of built off of what's happening and where folks' interests are in this product type to support more of that downtown as well. One of the big key recommendations, I think, or the big moves of the housing action plan is to encourage what we call middle housing options in single dwelling zones. When I say middle housing, I really mean in this context, duplexes and triplexes. So considering allowing duplexes and triplexes in R5 or R7 zones, or in areas that currently have single dwelling zoning. A couple specific recommendations in the development standards in the code would need to allow duplexes and triplexes first off. Number two would need to increase the density and reduce minimum lot size per unit to reach 18 dwelling units per acre for a triplex. So the density required to get to a triplex would require allowing 18 dwelling units per acre. We have a recommendation to consider revising rear yard setbacks to accommodate triplexes. There's currently a 20-foot rear yard setback requirement. If that were reduced to 10 feet, it requires more, or it allows more flexibility for a builder or for a designer to think about open space, on-site open space in a different way, and sort of have more creativity in some of the different amenities on a site. We also have a recommendation to consider reducing parking requirements. We did some testing here, some physical testing with our partners at Sarah Architects. And in a duplex and a triplex, you can physically fit 2 parking spaces per unit for both a duplex and a triplex. So you don't necessarily need to reduce them, the parking requirements, but it is something to consider if you wanted to have more open space requirements on a site, or just to think about the sort of limitations on smaller sites and how to prioritize, again, amenities on those sites. And then also to consider minimum site size requirements relative to homeownership goals. And this really means thinking about fee simple homeownership opportunities in a duplex and triplex context. So that's townhomes that look like duplexes or triplexes, and how to sort of support that given Auburn's housing element policies to support homeownership is a recommendation that we have here as well. I do want to note there's a couple different ways that Auburn could sort of start to think about introducing these housing types into single dwelling neighborhoods from a code perspective. One would be to allow duplexes and triplexes in R5 or R7 zone standards in the zoning code. The other would be to apply, there's a current R16 zone that exists in the code that isn't mapped anywhere, to consider using that R16 zone, maybe increasing the density allowances to 18 dwelling units per acre and mapping that in some strategic areas where the community is interested in seeing these housing types. And then the other would be to allow folks to go through a zoning map amendment process if those housing types were allowed and a builder, say, wanted to come in and do duplexes and triplexes, having a path forward, an amendment path forward to be able to do that as well. So some different options there. We did do some development feasibility testing as well on these duplex and triplex options in two contexts. One is thinking about infill and redevelopment, and the other is thinking about development on vacant land. And what we found is that the market today does not broadly support redevelopment of existing single-family homes into duplexes and triplexes. So if you all were thinking about allowing or wanting a more diverse housing options, duplexes or triplexes, that vacant sites, and that's either vacant portions of larger single-dwelling neighborhoods or newer greenfield sites, allowing middle housing on vacant sites is more likely to get these housing outcomes. There are, of course, example or opportunities that folks would take advantage of for very low cost existing housing that might redevelop over time, but predominantly we're finding that middle housing is mostly feasible on vacant sites. We have some specific recommendations on anti-displacement affordable housing preservation. A lot of these are really targeted towards continuing to support and strengthening the relationship with SCIP, again, the South King County Housing and Homelessness Partnership. They're doing great work. Auburn's been very supportive, both organizationally and financially with SCIP. And so continuing to do that through a lot of these recommendations. So we have a recommendation to monitor and track unregulated affordable housing. So that's naturally occurring affordable housing. SCIP is considering doing this or will be doing this as part of their work plan this next year. So coordinating with SCIP on regional efforts to track unregulated affordable housing. And Auburn has a unique opportunity to build off the existing rental licensing program to be able to do that. We have a recommendation to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing, the sort of same housing, not just track it, but preserve it. And again, coordination and partnership with SCIP and other regional housing agencies that do preservation or affordable housing development, and continue to build relationships with existing multifamily property owners and building managers throughout the community. Monitor and track regulated affordable housing units. There's a lot of regulated units that have, at some point in time, will have expiring affordability restrictions on them. So knowing when those affordability restrictions are going to expire and partnering with the King County Housing Authority or other partners to make sure that those stay affordable long-term is another strategy here as well. And then we have some specific program recommendations to identify opportunities to increase homeownership as well, which is really geared towards sort of household level stability and wealth generation on the homeownership side. So a quick note on implementation. These recommendations can be implemented in different ways. We will be finalizing this housing action plan. You all will hopefully be adopting the report itself. But the next steps are really up to the city and the community and you all to define a work plan and think about what the next steps are to start to implement some of these. So not all of them will be implemented right away. There are some that we think are helpful in implementing in the short term. We're starting to work on as you all start to scope out your housing element and comprehensive plan update process. Some of those are the zoning code and comprehensive plan process. There's some new programs that are going to take a little bit longer to think about, might require some financial commitments. So those might be a little bit longer out given the current fiscal environment. And there are some that are specific on increased partnership and collaboration. These recommendations will require further collaboration and engagement with city agencies and community stakeholders. So this is kind of the beginning of the conversation a little bit. And as you all pick some of these things up in the city and staff pick some of these up for further implementation, to re-engage with community stakeholders on what these recommendations might look like in terms of actual implementation. And city staff will need to assess the levels of effort and resources and develop a work plan to be able to execute on some of these as well. So with that, that was a whole lot of information. So I want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions for everyone.
Well, Tyler, thank you very much. We do have some questions coming up here. And excellent presentation, great information. And let's first start with Councilmember Malinga.
Thank you very much. Question was, you showed that the renters were severely overburdened, I think at 27%, and then you said those that are overburdened were like 50%. Was that 27% part of the 50%, or that 27% was an addition to the 50%?
Great question. Part of, so you're cost burdened and severely cost burdened, I guess is what I would say. So it's not 70+%, it's 53% total cost burdened. Of that, 27% are severely cost burdened.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. And then the second question, really quick, was I looked in your report and it shows the rents are around about 1,300 or so on average. Where do you see that going in the next 10 years if it keeps on the projection it's on right now?
You know, I don't see a scenario where things are getting more affordable for market rate housing.
Right.
And so, you know, I think it depends on two things. It depends on migration and sort of regional migration and what's going on in King County with folks. There's been a lot of sort of folks that have options in the region are making moves right now. And so where that settles will be interesting to see. But I think demand will be increasing over time as growth continues to happen. Both employment growth and population growth continue to happen within the region.
I think one of the things that I would add to what Tyler just said too is that there's a whole bunch of recommendations, but ultimately there is a big piece of this that comes down to supply.
Yep.
So Tyler pointed out that we're undersupplied right now, and we are not going to be able to overcome affordability issues as long as there is a restriction on supply. So that is something that we need to work on. Like Tyler said, I don't anticipate that all of these recommendations will get implemented in the same kind of period of time. What we really need to focus on is how we can do the things that we can do to help support catching up from the 2,600 or so units that we're already behind on.
That's a great point, Jeff.
All right. Councilmember Malinga, you and I think alike. I had that exact same question, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Let's go to Councilmember J. Raj.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Tyler, your projection for the rate of population growth, you're predicting about, your forecast is about 10,000 in the next 18 years. I think, you know, I personally feel that's going to be hitting very fast. Rather than 18 years, especially when we are in a growth mode right now. So with that said, I also understand the fact that if you build them, they will come, kind of a situation. But right now we don't have the capacity, is what we're seeing. So what do we do about that?
That's a great question. I might go back to Jeff Tate's last comment and really thinking about having a system and regulation set up so that demand can be met when it's there, so that supply can meet demand is one of the key first things. You know, Auburn's done a really good job with code. We've been doing a lot of these housing action plans and reviewing a lot of development standards and zoning code. And Auburn's code is helpful in terms of supporting development. I think what's kind of happening is the market is going to start to catch up with the effectiveness, honestly, of the code. And so making sure that there's, again, different housing options to meet the different needs of current and future Auburn residents is going to be really important. Having something besides a large lot detached single family house and a multifamily rental apartment, I think will be important for communities across the country, especially in South King County. And so, I think that you want to make sure that your standards and regulations are supportive of meeting that demand as it happens over time. And again, if you don't, if the housing doesn't get built, there will be price pressures without it. If
Right.
you don't have
Exactly.
that, that'll be a problem longer term. And we've seen that play out over the last development cycle, really, of it really increased demand, and supply not keeping up with that demand has impacted housing affordability across communities and across regions.
I do want to make sure that there's clarity on what that number, the 10,000, what that means. That's housing units.
Yep.
So do assume that number of 10,000 or so is equating to 25 or so thousand people. Because each unit will house, 2.5 people or so on average. So when Tyler mentions that in 18 years, there's a number of 10,000, that really equates to a larger population. And I can't emphasize enough, I feel like I've said this to City Council before, we really need in this city, not only to focus on, we can lose sight of what we already have, and we can focus so much on working on ways to promote more housing and more types of housing, and that's important. But it's super critical that we, as a city, take advantage of our 125-year-old or 130 years of housing stock that we have. There are just not enough programs in place in our community to help preserve what we have. And there is so much of what we have in our community that does help meet our housing supply and affordability objectives. So that's an area that we really need to work on. It's an area that of great opportunity with SCIP as they seek out to establish their capital fund. And we have the ability to, secure options to partner with private property owners or potentially becoming owners, not as a city, but more through SCIP. Ownership of and the ability to preserve property.
Well, thank you very much.
Councilmember Stearns.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor, and thank you, Tyler, for the really good presentation. Can you send us a copy of that presentation? I'd love to have that. And also I wanted to thank you. I think the last time you did a presentation, I asked a question about the impact on race, and I saw there's a really cool chart on page 17. So just that was really good to see. I had a question about you talked about density, which I do think is a good thing, and you talked about how our parking requirements. And I'm just sort of curious if you could tell us. Remind me again, what are the parking requirements, and then why do we have them? How did they come to be?
Yeah, that might be a great question for staff. In the parking requirements in two places that we looked at, we're really looking at two development types. One is in downtown Auburn. So in the downtown urban center, there's a parking requirement of 1 space per unit. And I know that that's different than other multifamily standards outside of downtown. In the single dwelling zones, we sort of just tested the current requirement for single family development in the R5, R7 zones. So there's a requirement in the single dwelling zones for 2 spaces per dwelling unit in the single dwelling zones. The reason that we think it's actually not that problematic, even in duplex and triplex, is because you can count off-street and on-street as your parking requirement. So in a duplex, you might have a garage, but you might also have a driveway. And so that driveway and the garage space satisfies the parking requirement. So there is some flexibility in the single dwelling zones. There's other communities, like I said, that have way more intense parking requirements, and Auburn's are pretty good. And I think have followed sort of best practices, specifically in downtown, around transit-oriented development and thinking about the downtown urban center in the past. Our recommendations are really a little more nuanced around efficiency of building and really optimizing the space in a building for housing units while still providing as much parking as you can within one floor of structured parking or underground or tuck under parking.
Right.
There are some.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
why do we have parking requirements? Or why does any city, I guess, have them? I mean, I lived in a large city in the East Coast and there are much less parking requirements.
Yeah, if I could throw in a few comments or thoughts about this, because there's a really parking's a really interesting thing, and it's probably there's a tension in a suburban community, because absolutely I understand what you mean. In much more urbanized areas, you know, the landscape of parking in downtown Seattle and the buildings that exist in downtown Seattle, people who live down there have a very different expectation or understanding of what parking's like versus when you come to a suburban community like Auburn. So while I don't disagree at all, Councilmember Stearns, I feel like if I live downtown, it might require that I park 8 blocks away from where I live, and I'd walk to where I live, and that would be okay. That's what I experienced when I lived in Seattle. There's a tension in our communities that we need to figure out. So while I don't disagree with anything that Tyler mentioned about us needing to revisit our parking requirements and always looking at that as an opportunity, but I can tell you that in downtown Auburn, we have buildings that have parking lots inside of them that are not full.
Yeah.
And part of what ends up happening is building owners might require a fee for parking in their building. And a tenant may choose not to pay that fee because they can park on the street. Then there's conflict in the streets between residents who might live downtown versus businesses and the shoppers that come and patron those businesses. It becomes really competitive in a downtown area, and the expectation, you know, that a tenant or a shopper or a store owner might have, that there should be parking available right in front of their business or their building. It's a very different kind of expectation than what one would experience in a much more urbanized area. So I think that there's a coupling of evaluations that need to be done. If we're looking at downtown parking and we're thinking about what standard there should be, we should be looking at also at how building owners manage their parking lots that sit half empty, because we have lots of parking downtown. It's just not always convenient or right in front of a store or a building that someone is visiting or living in. So there's a tension there. There's a tension in the surrounding areas when you get outside of downtown. I don't disagree, Tyler, that someone who has a garage and a driveway, that should be fairly adequate for parking. But it seems to be that common trend that people fill their garages with stuff and not cars, and cars end up in driveways and on streets. And some people in my own neighborhood have 6 cars for a 2-car garage and a 2-car driveway. So 2 cars are on the street, 2 cars are in the driveways, 2 cars are in the garage. And the denser that we get, the more precious that street frontage becomes, and the more conflicts there are when you have fire hydrants and post office boxes and separations between driveways. And again, it becomes very competitive. So I do think that it's important as we evaluate parking. It's not as simple as just looking at the code and saying we should reevaluate the number of stalls per unit, house, apartment, whatever. We have to look at it more holistically than that, because ultimately, if we have a developer build and we relax the parking requirements, the developer is done with the project, and we in the city are the ones facing all the complaints that come up because of how and where people develop their habits for how they park.
Wow. Well, thank you. That was really helpful. I mean, the policies behind that are pretty complex, but also, we got to deal with them. I appreciate that answer. I had another question. I can hold off on it if someone else needs to.
Oh, go ahead.
Tyler, you also talked about inclusionary zoning, and I'm just wondering, I really think that's a great idea too, but I'm just wondering, are there other good examples of where that's worked? Or are there other cities we can look at?
For a voluntary program, I think the voluntary program is really about calibrating MFTE in the right way, the way that we've looked at the financial incentives. And I think it's around really calibrating the tax exemption to the depth of affordability and the number of units and the duration of the affordability. There are certainly other jurisdictions that have been very successful with a MFTE that's focused on affordable housing. So I think you could look to what's a good one? Redmond has actually been very successful with their MFTE program and using that to think about affordable housing in their downtown. But there's a number of cities to look at, but it's one of those things where we looked at it, we're like, this is a good idea. There's a need probably to dig into that a little bit deeper if it's something that the city did decide to pursue, both from a fiscal impact, again, on that sort of tax piece of it, the foregone tax revenue for that period of time, as well as making sure that you are all are getting the sort of maximum public benefit for that tax exemption as well. But we looked at 20% of units at 80% MFI with a 12-year affordability requirement and a 12-year tax exemption, and it performed almost on par with if you did the parking requirement and the density bonus. So like there might be an option where you think about a regulatory approach where you change the parking, you allow more units, the density, or you can think about MFTE, and they had almost equal impacts on development feasibility. It was kind of interesting to see. So there's ways to calibrate and tailor a program to be to deliver the outcomes that the community in Auburn specifically wants to see.
Great, thank you.
Jeff Tate, thanks for bringing up the preservation piece again, as we know how critical that is, not only for us, but across the region. Couple points. One is we talk about the 10,000 units, and Tyler, you did a very good presentation on looking at duplexes, triplexes, increasing density, all those different items. But we still face the issue of limited buildable land on that, and how do we address that issue going forward?
I might let staff chime in here on the
it may be a question that can be answered now, but it's just one that put on the table because we know we're up against that, and 2040 is actually right around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, it doesn't answer the question directly. It's not a silver bullet by any stretch, but one of the things that we're doing right now is working through buildable lands analysis in partnership with the county. For those who aren't real familiar with that process, the county is the one under the Growth Management Act charged with planning for population growth target within the county. So a countywide number is established, and then that gets divided up amongst the different cities. So when Auburn is looking at its growth target, we have to look at what's realistic in terms of the capacity and the ability to accommodate the future population. So the work that's being done through the Housing Action Plan and understanding the existing conditions that Tyler presented back in February, that becomes a feeder of information into that analysis to understand how not only to work towards the projection, but to also understand how to fill in the gap, the supply gap that we already have in place right now. So when you're doing a buildable lands analysis, you are evaluating what land area you have to work with to accommodate those growth targets. And really, there's only two options. I mean, you can mix these two options, but you either expand your urban growth area so that you have more land, or you reevaluate the density and development standards within your urban growth area to accommodate more within that boundary. There's pros and cons to both, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can do a little bit of both. That's a really intense process. It evaluates how critical areas and environmentally sensitive features play into growth potential, because you have to carve those out. When you're creating rights of way, that is an area that you're carving out because that's not going to be an area that you're accommodating housing. And you really have to factor in whether urban services can reach the areas that are capable of being developed from a zoning perspective. We have areas in town where when you look at a map, it might look like 5 acres, 10 acres of undeveloped land. But if you are a mile away from urban services like water and sewer, it's not a very viable and likely area that's going to be developed within a certain horizon. I didn't answer your question at all.
No, you actually touched on some excellent points, because that was the purpose of my question, because we're up against it. We know we are.
Right.
And having that opportunity to be able to go in and analyze it, doing that study is going to provide council and future council that opportunity to understand why and how this happens, and what our density means, and what our growth area means as well. I have one more comment, and then I'll turn it over to Councilmember Trout-Manuel for a question. So a few of us, maybe 2 or 3 of us, remember the former Elizabeth Chamberlain, who presented us with a study on parking downtown and a report. I actually still have it on my desk in the office, but perhaps, Jeff, we could pass, even though it's dated, share that with the council so they can see the thought process that went into our downtown parking situation a few years ago. And that was well before we had 4 new apartment complexes downtown. But I think it gives us an opportunity to go back and kind of revisit that and perhaps update that as we go forward. So just a recommendation there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that recommendation. And I hate to blame things on COVID. Lots of things get blamed on COVID, but we literally a year and a half ago had this scoped out to do an update. Public Works Department was going to take the lead in that update. But the 2 departments, Community Development, Public Works, had started the conversation, had put the scope of work together essentially for hiring the consultant to update that plan. And we sort of stepped back from that when we didn't know what the budget impacts of COVID would be. So one more thing that got impacted by that, but we can certainly share that document, and it definitely needs to be updated. Lots of conditions that have changed.
Absolutely. Appreciate that very much. Councilmember Trout-Manuel.
Yes. Thank you, Tyler and Jeff, for a great presentation. Given us a lot to think about and review. And as Councilmember Stearns mentioned, Tyler, that chart that the cost burdens by race, that is very helpful to see where we're at. Also, you mentioned about building those units is not condos, but not tripeds.
Micro unit?
Yes. Share more about that, exactly what that is.
Yeah, sure. They are, smaller, generally very small in many situations, anywhere between, we've seen them between 350 and 475 square feet per unit. They're small efficiency studio apartments are what they are. And they're market rate affordable new construction in most situations that we see them. But again, they're for smaller household sizes. They're not, that's not the solution to larger household sizes, but it is an emerging trend that I think is going to be increasingly important in the future.
Okay, and how big a space would you need to build duplex? You showed a picture of them, and how much land are we looking to build something like that in our city?
Yeah, great question. So we looked at what we call prototypes. So we sort of came up with a average single family site size and looked to see how a duplex could fit on there. So we did look at mostly on a 5,000 square foot site, in a sort of that R5 zoning standard, R5, R7 zoning standard. And there was, and a 7,500 square foot site. It's not a challenge to fit duplexes on the sites with the current development standards. And, I mentioned before that Auburn's code is actually helpful in supporting development. we used the existing setback requirements, the existing building coverage requirements, and parking and rear setback and everything, and we were able to get them to fit. So there's not really, from a code perspective, there's not that many hurdles to thinking about duplexes. And there's a lot of, I should note too, that there's a lot of communities across the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest that are thinking about doing this thing right now, that are more on the sort of forward edge, leading edge of this sort of progressive thinking about different housing types. A number in King County. In Oregon, I think I mentioned a planning commission. Oregon, it's actually now required, the state required that all cities over 20,000 people are required to allow duplexes and triplexes in their single dwelling zone. So lots of communities are thinking about it. It's a sort of thing that's come up in lots of different contexts. I've been working with AARP actually on some national housing policy work, and the AARP is really interested in these housing types to allow older households and folks to age in the community and have an opportunity to stay in the neighborhood that's not a 3,000 square foot house on a 5,000 square foot lot and have different options. So lots of interest in this housing type in this policy.
Good. Just one more question.
Sure, go ahead.
And Jeff, you didn't answer his question, but you answered it for me because I was going to ask this similar question that Deputy DeCoursey said, so thank you.
Okay, Council, I would continue to encourage you to review the draft housing action plan and continue to look at comments and questions we can pass on to Director Tate and others. I think it's important for us to continue to review this as soon as it's going to come to council soon for adopting this. And this is a critical piece of our future of the city with that as well. So Tyler, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And Jeff Dixon, thank you. And always Jeff Tate. Appreciate it very much. Now we'll move into the piece that goes before all the action plan and before we actually build stuff. So we're going to move into our next item, which is SEPA and Environmental Review Series 1 of 6 presentations. Director Tate.
Yeah, thank you. And I am going to first introduce Alexandria Teague, Planner 2 within the Planning Services Group, as well as Jeremy Hammer, also a planner within the Planning Services Group of the department. So the two of them are going to provide a presentation. And this was really a result of Councilmember Stearns making a request to learn a little bit more about programs that the city runs for environmental protection. So I don't want to steal any of their thunder, so I'll turn it over to Alexandria and Jeremy for the presentation.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me. I actually do this quite often with Teams, but not so much on Zoom. Can you see my screen, please? Yes. Excellent. Okay. Okay, so I am in presentation mode. Excellent. All right. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Alexandria. I am a planner in the Community Development Department. I'm here with Jeremy Hammer. He's also a planner in the Community Development Department. This is the first in a series of 6 presentations that we'll give to council over the course of the year, basically to discuss the city's array of environmental regulations and programs. We're covering the State Environmental Policy Act, or SEPA. We'll use that acronym quite a bit tonight. Our presentation actually begins on page 163 in your packet, and we have about 8 slides to go through. So in order to get through our slides, we do request that you hold your questions to the end of our presentation. Okay, so let's get started with some background. So the National Environmental Policy Act, of which SEPA is based on, was enacted in 1969. It was with the purpose, essentially, of declaring a national policy which would encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment. SEPA, or NEPA, requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of their proposed actions prior to making decisions. The State Environmental Policy Act, as I mentioned, was enacted in 1971. And prior to its adoption, there were concerns that government decisions did not reflect environmental considerations. State and local agencies had responded there was no authority for them to address environmental issues. So SEPA, which was modeled after NEPA in 1969, was enacted to fill this need. SEPA gives agencies the tools to both consider and mitigate for the environmental impacts of proposals. Provisions were also included to ensure the involvement of the public, tribes, and interested agencies in decisions with environmental impacts. So at the state level, SEPA is a hierarchy. It starts with the statutory rules that govern SEPA under the RCW, then in the WAC, which governs SEPA procedures, and finally implementation at the local level. The city's implementation of SEPA is codified in Chapter 1606 of our city code.
All right, thank you, Alex. There are three key provisions of SEPA. First, SEPA creates a disclosure process for agencies and the public. SEPA requires the identification and evaluation of probable impacts, and an agency must appropriately consider the likely environmental consequences of such impacts prior to authorizing. An agency review consists of evaluating the SEPA environmental checklist, known as a SEPA checklist, and supporting documentation such as background or supporting analyses, studies, or technical reports. The city's evaluation of the SEPA checklist and supporting documentation is accompanied by a written decision and is made available for comments from the public and agencies with expertise. For example, Puget Sound Clean Air Agency is an agency with expertise in air quality. Ecology is an agency with expertise in solid and hazardous waste. Number two, SEPA includes a public comment opportunity for projects. Depending on the type of decision, SEPA provides a 14-day comment period and either a 14 or 21-day appeal period. We will discuss the 14-day comment period and the appeal periods later in the presentation. Third, SEPA addresses regulatory gaps or can be considered a safety net. It requires evaluation of impacts that may not be addressed by other regulations, such as environmental health, noise, historic and cultural preservation, recreation, and transportation, which are not traditionally addressed in SEPA or in critical area ordinances. At this time SEPA was created, environmental regulations were not as common or extensive as they presently are. The SEPA ordinance, which we'll cover later in the presentation, or later in the series, actually, excuse me, is intended to protect the areas that can be identified and characterized as critical or environmentally sensitive, including wetlands, streams, wildlife habitat, geologic hazards, aquifer recharge areas, and flood hazards. For example, the critical area ordinance specifies regulations related to the protection, modification, and preservation of wetlands. Next slide, please. SEPA applies throughout state at all levels, county, state, and city. All levels use the decision of the SEPA lead agency. We'll cover the lead agency later in the presentation. SEPA applies to nearly all governmental actions. These are defined in the Washington Administrative Code, or the WAC, containing SEPA rules. It's chapter 197-11 of the WAC, and include new and continuing activities, including projects and programs, which are entirely or partly financed, assisted, conducted, regulated, licensed, or approved by agencies. New and revised agency rules, regulations, plans, policies, or procedures, and legislative proposals. SEPA applies to both project and non-project actions. The governing WAC describes the project and non-project actions as a project action. A project action involves a decision on a specific project, such as the construction or management activity located in a defined geographic area. An example of this would be construction of a 50,000 square foot industrial building that would require SEPA, or Auburn School District school construction. Non-project actions involve decisions on policies, plans, or programs. For example, the following non-project actions would require SEPA review: the adoption or amendment of legislation, ordinances, rules, or regulations that contain standards controlling use or modification of the environment, the adoption or amendment of comprehensive land use plans or zoning ordinances, creation of a district or annexations to any city, town, or district, capital budgets, and road, street, and highway plans.
Okay, trying to advance my slides. So let's talk about exemptions to SEPA. So the WAC governing SEPA rules allows for categorical exemptions. Under the WAC, a categorical exemption means a type of action that does not significantly affect the environment. The categorical exemptions are identified in the SEPA rules, specifically WAC 197.11.300 and 197.11.800. The examples of categorical exemptions for minor construction activities include the construction or location of 4 single-family detached dwelling units, the construction of an office, school, commercial, recreational, service, or storage building of 4,000 square feet in size, and with associated parking facilities designed for 20 automobiles. This exemption also includes parking lots for 20 or fewer automobiles not associated with the structure. Also for any fill or excavation of 100 cubic yards of the total lifetime of the fill or excavation. Exemptions can also include such things as administrative procedures, city budgets, and property purchases. Examples of this include the purchase or acquisition of real property, the procurement and distribution of general supplies, equipment, and services, the borrowing of funds, issuance of bonds, or applying for a grant-related financing agreements, the review and payment of vouchers and claims, and also the establishment and collections of liens and service billings. Cities and towns may also raise the exemption level by implementing ordinance or resolution. In the city's SEPA ordinance, Auburn has actually established higher exempt levels for minor new construction. So for example, for the residential dwelling units, instead of 4 dwelling units, it's 20 dwelling units or less. For that school, office, commercial, recreational buildings I mentioned, instead of 4,000 square feet, it's 12,000 square feet. And for 40 or fewer automobiles, and for standalone parking lots that are 40 or fewer automobiles. And for fill and excavation, up to 500 cubic yards or less. But there are certain exemptions in which, certain situations, in which exemptions do not apply. So exemptions do not apply if the project is, number 1, undertaken wholly or partly like lands covered by water. Lands covered by water essentially means lands underlying the state areas, underlying the water areas of the state below the ordinary high water mark. So this generally includes like salt waters, tidal marshes, estuarine waters, natural water courses, or lakes, and of course, wetlands, which are common in Auburn. Number 2, it's not exempt if the proposal is a series of actions, some of which are categorically exempt and some of which are not, or is a series of exempt actions that together may have a probable significant adverse environmental impact. And 3, the proposal is just within a critical area. Okay, so I'd like to run through Auburn's SEPA process. A copy of the blank SEPA environmental checklist is actually included on page 171 of your packet if you'd like to take a look at it. So the SEPA process generally begins once the applicant completes and submits the environmental checklist and supporting documentation with a required application. A SEPA checklist cannot be submitted on its own. Rather, the action or non-project action permit must accompany the SEPA. So SEPA needs an action. Once a proposal is made, the agency must determine whether the environmental review is required by understanding, defining the entire proposal, identifying any agency actions. This includes plans, permits, or licenses. And 3, deciding if the proposal is actually categorically exempt. Once the environmental review, if the environmental review is required, then the lead agency is identified. And the lead agency is responsible for conducting the environmental analysis and all of the procedural steps under SEPA. So in land use decisions, both with non-project and project action, the lead agency is generally the city, the county, or the city, like City of Auburn. Most often, as I mentioned, the City of Auburn is the lead agency, though this isn't always the case. Determining the lead agency is important because all agencies with jurisdiction must rely on the same SEPA decision unless it's contested, which is rare. An agency with jurisdiction under SEPA has an action or decision regarding some aspect of the total proposal. All agencies with jurisdiction have a legal responsibility to consider the environmental information disclosed in the SEPA process. For example, in the construction of the new Auburn School District schools, the Auburn School District, not the city, was the lead agency. However, the city of Auburn was and is still an agency with jurisdiction since we are in the position of issuing the permits, the building permits and the civil permits. So after that, the proposal is finally evaluated. The lead agency must review the environmental checklist and other information available submitted with the proposal and evaluate the proposal's likely environmental impacts, whether the impacts are significant or not significant. After evaluating the proposal, the lead agency, we issue a threshold determination. If non-significant, a determination of non-significance or DNS is issued. If issued with conditions, the DNS becomes a mitigated determination of non-significance or MDNS. So I want to pause real quick on the meaning of DNS and an MDNS. So a DNS and MDNS doesn't mean there aren't any impacts. It means there aren't any impacts that are beyond what our adopted laws and code already address. A DNS is issued when, as stated in the governing WAC, there will be no probable significant adverse environmental impacts from the proposal. The lead agency can actually work with the applicant to reduce the probable significant impacts by either revising the proposal or identifying mitigation measures. If the lead agency specifies mitigation measures on an applicant's proposal and the proposal is actually revised to include those measures, then the lead agency can go ahead and issue a DNS. The DNS is actually the most frequent threshold determination that's made by the city. The lead agency can also condition the checklist to include mitigation measures and issue an MDNS. However, the conditions that are applied to an MDNS, they must be based on city policy authority. So essentially the comprehensive plan has to have applicable policies to the conditions that are being applied. Following the agency's threshold determination of a DNS or even an MDNS, a public notice is issued and a 14-day comment period is observed. The notice for the threshold determination is sent to interested parties, agencies with expertise, agencies with jurisdiction. It's published in the newspaper of general circulation, that's the Seattle Times, and is posted at the City Hall and the Annex and on the city's public notice webpage. For a project action SEPA, it is also mailed to the public. The postcards are mailed to the public within a 300-foot radius of the project. And it's also placed on notice boards. Those are big yellow notice boards that we require applicants to essentially put at the site adjacent to the right-of-way. And then finally, following the public comment period, a 14-day or 21-day appeal period is observed. And based on per the governing WAC, 7 additional days are added onto the appeal period for an MDNS, which makes the appeal period 21 days instead of 14 days. And prior to the issuance of any permit, the appeal period has to be exhausted. Okay.
All right, thank you. Now let's back up briefly to discuss when the likely environmental impacts are determined significant. Note that an EIS, environmental impact statement, is uncommon in most projects since most do not rise to the level of scale of an EIS. However, an EIS was completed in the past for the Auburn Downtown Plan in 2001. The EIS for the Downtown Plan was a non-project action, though an EIS can be completed for project actions as well. A non-project action focuses on the qualitative and quantitative analysis of environmental impacts as appropriate to the scope of the proposal and the level of planning. The environmental analysis for the Downtown Plan was analyzed on a downtown-wide level. The Downtown EIS analyzed all anticipated impacts that would occur as part of the future development within the downtown area. The purpose of the Downtown EIS was to facilitate development in the downtown area, as there would be no need for case-by-case mitigation, which can oftentimes make things unpredictable to developers and add considerable costs and time delays to projects. So let's run through that EIS process. After evaluating the proposal, the lead agency must determine whether a proposal will still have any likely significant adverse environmental impacts. If the lead agency determines that a proposal may have a probable significant adverse environmental impact, the responsible official shall prepare and issue a determination of significance, DS. The issuance of the DS requires the preparation of an environmental impact statement, EIS. A scoping document is issued with the DS to determine the scope of the environmental impacts that will be analyzed in the EIS. Next, in the scoping process, the lead agency narrows the scope of the EIS to the probable significant adverse impacts and reasonable alternatives, including mitigation measures. For example, if there are only 2 or 3 significant impacts or alternatives, the EIS will focus on those. The DS scoping period lasts for 14 days. The lead agency invites other agencies with jurisdiction, expertise, affected tribes, and the public to comment. The lead agency may expand the scoping process. The governing WAC provides that the scoping period may be expanded to conduct certain activities. Following the scoping period, a draft EIS is issued by the lead agency. Any person or agency shall have 30 days from the date of the issuance in which to review and comment upon the draft EIS. After 30 days, a final EIS is issued by the lead agency and sent to the Department of Ecology, to all agencies with jurisdiction, and to all agencies who commented on the draft EIS, and to anyone requesting a copy of the final EIS. The final EIS cannot be acted upon prior to 7 days after issuance of the final EIS, at which point the final EIS becomes agency deal. And following the agency decision, an appeal period of 14 days is observed. Next page, please, Alex. Thank you. That concludes this presentation. If there are any questions regarding the information we have went over, we'll take those questions now.
Questions, Council, for Jeremy or Alexandria?
Councilmember J. Raj has raised his hand.
Councilmember J. Raj, go ahead.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I've got 2 questions. The first one is I was trying to figure out what EIS meant. I was looking through the pages and I don't see what EIS stands for.
Oh, sorry about that. So EIS stands for Environmental Impact Statement. It is the document that is prepared for this with a determination of significance, or a DS, as Jeremy mentioned.
Environmental Impact Statement. Okay. The second question is to you, Alexandra. Oh, by the way, thank you very much for the presentation. So when you talked about Auburn specific exemptions, can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Because I started thinking about the fact that what kind of exemptions do we need to build minor new constructions? I mean, what would stop them from building a minor new construction is what I'm trying to get at.
So the exemptions that are shown here, the 4 examples of minor new construction, I didn't actually, first of all, I don't think this is the complete list of minor new exemptions. In SEPA, the WAC, it's 197.11.800. There's an exhaustive list of minor new construction that is exempt in SEPA. I just pulled out the 4 that Auburn raised the threshold, the exemption threshold. So these 4 you see here are, again, 4 in the WAC that we've under our code we've raised the levels of threshold, and the reason for that is to facilitate development in the city. So instead of doing a short plat, requiring SEPA with a short plat or a short subdivision of 4 dwelling units, we've raised it to 20 dwelling units or less. So that doesn't exempt it from if there's a wetland on site, but those threshold, raising those exemption levels is intended to help facilitate development, intended to help facilitate minor new construction. Does that answer your question?
Not quite. So this is based on Environmental Policy Act, right?
Yes.
So what environmental issues that we have other than wetlands that would stop construction from taking place?
Well, there are a number of environmental features in the city that maybe they don't necessarily inhibit development or prevent development, but they don't prevent it, but they inhibit it. It'll be part of a presentation later on in the series, but we do have a number of environmental or sensitive areas, including, see if I can remember them, streams, lots of streams, wetlands, geologic hazards. This includes landslide hazards, erosion prone areas, essentially areas that are pretty steep in the city. Wildlife habitat areas. There are a number of areas that are mapped by the Department of Fish and Wildlife mapping system as heron habitat. Trying to think, and groundwater protection areas, especially those groundwater protection areas that are, I think, ranked under number 1, which is the most restrictive, that perhaps it's close to a well. So those are a number of critical areas that could inhibit development, and SEPA doesn't, the exemption doesn't apply for those areas that have critical areas or sensitive areas on them.
So I think one thing that I would add is that most codes, it's not unique to Auburn, most codes don't necessarily outright prohibit development activity due to what's on the ground. There are exceptions to that. We do have a few prohibitions, but most of the time it's SEPA and our regulations that address how we protect those resources. Sometimes protecting the resource starts with avoiding it. Sometimes it's unavoidable. And then you get in a situation of how do you mitigate impacts so that the impact is either softened on site, or maybe it's even, in the case of a wetland, if you're forced into filling a portion of a wetland, you might have to do wetland mitigation off-site, where you're recreating new wetland or you're restoring degraded wetland. So we don't start with any prohibitions to speak of. I shouldn't say any. There are very few prohibitions that we start with. It's mostly about addressing the impact. And one thing that I think is important is that when SEPA was created, 50 years ago now, cities and counties, for the most part, didn't have regulations that protected environmental features. So understand the historic context of this too, is that jurisdictions were using SEPA back in the 70s to address all environmental impacts. Nowadays, we have wetland regulations, we have stream buffer regulations, we have shoreline regulations, we have all sorts of different types of regulations in place. So SEPA helps fill the gap when we encounter something on it as part of a development where we don't have a code that helps address what we're wanting to protect or what we're wanting to mitigate. So it comes in handy. It comes in handy oftentimes when we're addressing transportation impacts. Can it come in handy when we're trying to address archaeological impacts? If we have an archaeological resource in the city that we're trying to protect and we don't have a code that helps us protect that. So that might, I'm not sure that fully answers your question, but hopefully that adds some context around the question or what the information you're seeking.
Yes, it does. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Alexandra.
Other questions, council?
Councilmember Stearns has raised his hand.
Councilmember Stearns?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I was just wondering, if SEPA has any impact, not really on the restrictive side, but on the, I guess, encouragement side. Does it have any impact on, say climate change, greenhouse gases, clean energy?
I think I need to think about that. I believe in the non-project portion of the SEPA checklist, there are questions that address greenhouse gases. I'd have to take a look, unfortunately. I don't have that in front of me. It is in the packet, but I believe there are energy conservation questions, energy uses questions, maybe greenhouse gas questions on the non-project action portion of the SEPA checklist. I don't know that it's on the project action portion. There is energy usage, but I don't know if that addresses greenhouse gases.
There's also air quality questions, which could, I guess, kind of delve into that a little bit as well. Just in the regular the standard checklist that we have included in the packet.
But I think in terms of encouraging, it does require applicants to do the research, to complete the checklist, to do their homework, look at your energy usage, look at, are you under the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, their mapping system? Is there any sort of archaeological inventory nearby? So I perhaps in a way it does encourage applicants by forcing them to do the research to complete the checklist.
I think it's fair to say that when the checklist was created, if you go through the checklist, it's 18 pages, it's a lot, but it's missing some things. That checklist was created decades ago. And while you look at the checklist, you'll see subject areas like surface water and groundwater and wildlife and noise and air quality. There's lots of areas and opportunity to touch on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and the goals for reducing greenhouse gases. But SEPA is not modern enough to holistically address that. I think that's fair to say. I think that outside of SEPA, when you look at the countywide planning policies for climate action objectives and greenhouse gas reductions, we are able to build on that as a foundational piece. The city has conducted a couple of greenhouse gas inventories and developed climate action strategies. And perhaps that's something that would be worthwhile distributing to city council, because that is now probably just before the arrival of our newest council members. So additionally, there have been legislative initiatives or efforts down in Olympia to add a climate change element to comprehensive plans. So right now we have to have a land use element, a housing element, an economic development element. So I think there's 7 elements that we're required to have. So climate action is one that is being introduced now, and that's kind of a direction that I think we're all heading to force that into policy. But the SEPA checklist is not the document that's going to be able to holistically address that. It's not a modern checklist, and it should be modernized to address that. We don't necessarily have the authority to go in and change the checklist a great deal, because the checklist is actually incorporated into the WAC. So cities don't come up with their own checklist to speak of. It's a very valid question to ask, and it's probably disappointing to know that SEPA is not current enough to address climate change and greenhouse gas objectives, but there are other things that are being done to work on that.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer.
Other questions, council? All right. Alexandria, Jeremy, thank you very much for the presentation. And we'll look forward to the remaining presentations to come forward to council here in the future. Thank you for your time tonight.
Excellent. Thank you, council.
Okay, council. We will now move into ordinance number 6818 with, 6816 with Director Thomas.
Good evening, Council. I'm Jamie Thomas, Finance Director. In just a moment, I'm going to pass this presentation off to Joan Nelson, our Utility Billing Manager. But just to kind of crosswalk how we've gotten where we're at and what we're discussing tonight, just wanted to remind Council that back in November of 2020, you had adopted our new waste management contract. They are going to be our solid waste contractor beginning in October of 2021 with our new solid waste contract. We've been holding off on a utility rate study for our solid waste fund, really waiting for this new waste management contract to go into effect, knowing that it was going to be a major driver in our utility rates moving forward. So after Council adopted the new waste management contract in November of 2020, we engaged with Sound Resource Management, who has been doing our rate study for our solid waste fund. They do solid waste or utility rate studies for other municipalities throughout the region. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Joan. She will talk to you about the work that they've been doing with our rate study, as well as a lot of elements with our new service contract with waste management, considering they are such a large driver in the utility rates that we are going to be proposing. So with that, and nothing else more to add to the conversation, I'm going to pass it on to Joan.
Okay, good evening. I am going to share my screen here. Hopefully. Okay, can everyone see 2021 Auburn Solid Waste Rate Study? Okay, we'll get started then. If I can get it to, there we go. Okay, so Jamie gave you a background in kind of why we're here. The last solid waste rate increase was January 1st of 2014. And we have met with Sound Resource Management over the years since, periodically checking how our fund balance is doing. But the rates that we set then, performed better than expected. Also, the economy was very strong. Solid waste follows the economy. And so it gave us the ability to absorb the increases to service costs as they came, because as a city that sets its retail rates, we were able to absorb the 16.3% waste management consumer price index increases since that time. There was also two different King County tipping fee increases. One was 12% in 2017, another was 4.7% in 2019. So all those happened, but our fund was very strong. And we just kept on chugging away. But however, we now have a new solid waste contract. We renegotiated back in 2011, which was very favorable for both parties. And I've been told many times in the years since that we had very favorable rates. So when we went out for a competitive process in 2019, 2020, we came back with a new contract. Waste management's rates were lower than the competitor, but they're a lot higher than where our rates were at. Due to just, the higher cost to provide service, equipment costs have gone up in those years, and the recycling markets have been very unstable, as many of you over the time have heard of green fence, China sword, blue sky, all of the different market issues with recycling. So all of those things contributed to higher costs in our new contract. So one thing that makes us different than many cities is we do have a solid waste fund. It's one of our enterprise funds here at the city. It allows us to set the rates for residents and businesses. So you may hear, our city rates, we kind of call our retail rates. And then we have our contractor rates, which we pay waste management, we call our wholesale rates. So having this fund, as I talked about, lets us, have a little flexibility in when we as a city choose to change rates and how much we need to change rates, depending on how our fund balance is doing. We always try to maintain at least 60 days of operating costs in our fund. And so that's one of the drivers of our rate model. We also want each service sector, we call residential, commercial, and then roll-off are each a service sector. We want them to cover their own expenses. That way, if there's different service level changes, different number of customers coming and going, one sector doesn't become dependent and get subsidized by another sector. Garbage service is also mandatory in the city of Auburn. This provides not only stable service levels, but also it's just, nice to know that everyone has regular garbage service. It's a public health issue if people don't. So we support that mandatory service. The solid waste fund, in addition to paying for all the services, it also funds our litter control services. So we've had a litter control crew for many, many years. We had Vadis in the past. That was a service organization. They had really low rates because they actually got additional state money to help that group. So they made a choice to not provide those services anymore. So we had to go do something else and we had to contract out. We used Recology Cleanscapes for a few years. And then with this contract, we decided to wrap it in. And so Waste Management is now providing a 2-person crew to do litter control. As many of you have seen, and throughout the past year, litter and illegal dumping have become just out of control. It's not just an Auburn issue, it's a nationwide issue. I think there's been articles in the New York Times about it and things like that. So this year, our directors worked to coordinate. So now we actually have 2 additional city seasonal crews. So 4 additional staff to help out the 2 waste management staff that are out there. Those 2 crews just started within the last month, but hopefully we see a difference in how clean our streets are. So I'm excited about it. So with this rate study, as Jamie said, we hired Sound Resource Management, and they have this complex model. And so I'm going to go over kind of the assumptions that we make and some of the things that we put into this model to figure out where our rates are going to end up and where our revenues need to be. So one thing is the city utility tax. As many of you know, it increased this year from 7% to 10%. We also have a consumer price index estimation of 3% per year. Not only is that for waste management's contract services, but our city administrative costs as well. And then King County tipping fee increases. They're doing a rate study right now. So there's another tipping fee coming. And then also just maintaining, we obviously have an adequate fund balance right now, but just maintaining that fund balance. And then overall, the waste management new contract rates are about 25% higher than what our previous contract rates were. And there's a little fluctuation depending on the service sector. For instance, some residential rates are 48% higher than what they were with our previous contract. So significant increases. We're also adding approximately 4,000 residential customers when we take in that West Hill and Lee Hill annexation areas. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about these things. I just wanted to kind of give you an overall list of items. So King County tipping fee increases. Right now we're at $140.82 per ton. The rate study that is going through to Dow Constantine right now is projecting about $154.02 for January 1st, 2022. And then they have projected $168.45 for 2023. Some driving factors with King County's tipping fee increases are they have a lot of capital projects going on. We have aging transfer stations. If anyone's been to Algona recently, they know. So they just rebuilt the Factoria transfer station. The picture in the top right is of council member and I with Dow Constantine at that grand opening a couple years ago. And then South County transfer station, they will be rebuilding Algona. They're in the design process still, but that is expected to open in 2024. Maybe a little bit delayed, but hopefully soon. That's going to provide advanced services for us. It won't just be garbage anymore. It'll have a suite of recycling services as well and yard waste. So there's a big move to make sure that all of the transfer stations provide equitable services for all residents of King County. And then they're also citing a new transfer station in the Northeast. And these transfer stations, they have huge price tags to them. So they're trying to do all the bonding and build those costs into those tipping fees. So looking at just, I kind of gave you our Auburn's 2020 just garbage tonnage. And so with that tonnage right there, the increase of $154.02 increases just our tipping, our weight of our garbage by over $600,000. So it just kind of shows how, you know, a 9% increase in that, how big of an increase it is to our ratepayers. So another one of the assumptions was that fund balance that I had talked about. We always want to maintain that 60 days of operating costs, which is equivalent to 12 to 16% in reserves. What's happening now is we have this huge contract rate increase. So it brings on the need to increase our rates, but we've tried to smooth it out over a 27-month period. So really just focus on 2021, 2022, 2023 is the rates that we're bringing to you today. But I just wanted to show you in this table, 2024 to 2026, how once we get through this push of these huge rates with this contract rate increase and big tipping fee, we're hoping to smooth out and have smaller rate increases. So, you know, you can see if you look at the middle line, increase, decrease of our fund balance, we're actually still going to lose money this year, and we're going to lose money in 2022. But by 2023, we'll be about breaking even, and the different service sectors, everyone will be covering their costs with their rates, and we'll have our 60-day fund balance. So that's our goal. This rate model and the rates that we're bringing to you today help us meet all of our goals, keeping each sector supporting itself, and keeping those reserves where they need to be. And then hopefully, you know, when we come to you for the next set of rate increases, they'll be smaller incremental rate increases that are much more, you know, better for the ratepayers. So I've already touched on the new contract rates. Again, Waste Management's proposal was $500,000 less than Republic Services, but still there was a lot of factors that went into these higher rates, especially COVID had just hit when rates were, proposals were due in April. And so there's also significant program changes. The city right now, we do our own customer service and we do the billing for solid waste. We are handing those over to the hauler. So the hauler will be doing the customer service and they'll also be billing on our behalf. So we'll still retain our fund, but they are going to be doing the billing, and then we set the rates and we keep the funds. This is going to be much more efficient for the residents and the businesses. That way, the people picking up the garbage are the people they call. And when they call for a concern, those service agents are going to have all the information right there. They'll be able to answer every question. They'll have account notes. They'll have timestamps on pickups. Whereas right now, the city is the middle person. And we, you know, if someone calls and they, you know, they want to, they have an issue, we have to email Waste Management, see what the account notes say, and then get back to the person. So it's going to be much more efficient and kind of more streamlined for the customer. The rates are cost of service. Again, that's a big thing to make sure there's no cross subsidies among the different service sectors. And as I talked about, those residential rate increases are anywhere from 29 to 48% in the contractor rate. This is not the city's retail rate, but this is the contractor rate in the contract. So for instance, the 35-gallon garbage for residential, which over half of our residential customers have that 35-gallon size, the contract rate is going up by $7.45. It's a big jump. So with this, I just wanted to touch kind of quickly. I've touched on some of this. Again, they're doing the billing and the customer service. They're doing the litter crew. And they started the litter crew January 1st, thankfully, so we didn't have a gap in services. Also, one big thing I know everyone looks forward to is our annual bulky item collection for residential customers. This is changing to more of an on-demand. So that way, when your hot water tank goes out, you don't have to wait until the annual event. You can actually call up one time per year and you get up to 4 items that get picked up for free. So it's going to be much more convenient for the customer. It'll make it so our city doesn't have giant items out, you know, for 1 week out of the year and create a big mess. And so I'm excited for this event for people to have that convenience. Another big thing is unlimited recycle for businesses. This is going to help promote our waste reduction efforts. Right now, our contract has a limit of 150% of your you can have 150% of your garbage size. So if you have a 2-yard garbage, you can have a 3-yard recycle. But say you're reducing your waste, but you have a lot of cardboard. Right now, businesses don't want to reduce their garbage size because they want that 3-yard recycle. Whereas now, they can have whatever size of recycle that they need, you know, so they can reduce their cost, reduce their garbage if they're truly, you know, just have a lot of recycle they need to get rid of. And then we did add a 45-gallon cart option for both residential and commercial. As I said, 35 is the most popular residential size, but you know, people have trouble sometimes keeping that lid shut and getting all that garbage in that container, but they don't really need to go to a 64-gallon garbage. So this is going to give them an option in between that. So if they just need a little bit more space, they can now jump to the 45-gallon, not get the expensive extra garbage charges, and don't have to go all the way to the 64. So also new collection vehicles. The top right picture is a picture of Federal Way's brand new vehicle last year. So we'll get brand new vehicles too, except ours will have an AUB and then the number for Auburn. And also new carts and dumpsters. So we have all new colors coming. Garbage is going to be gray. Food and yard is going to be green. So those two are swapping. And they're going to have some nice decal symbols. So a little garbage can on the garbage and a recycle symbol for recycle, and then a little apple core and leaf for the food and yard cart. So you will see if you're on Auburn Way North, where the old Posable RV, you're going to start seeing lots of containers arriving because waste management is ramping up. And right now the steel dumpsters are coming in. And then over the next couple months, the carts will come in. So it's going to be a big storage lot that they'll dispatch out and swap carts out of. And again, this is a picture of the solid waste service area. Right now, the area in blue is serviced by Republic Services. Again, it's a little over 4,000 residential customers and about 30 commercial / multifamily. And so coming October 1st, the city will have one service provider for the whole entire city. We'll be able to put out messages, same message for everybody. Everyone has the same services, the same programs, and the same rates. So I'm truly excited. I've been here for a long time. At one point, we had 3 haulers in the city. It made trying to get messages out very interesting, especially during snow. So looking forward to it. But it also, you know, there's a cost for all these customers. And briefly, before we go dig into the model, I just wanted to give you guys kind of an idea of what's going to be happening over the next few months as we get ready for this transition. The commercial customers received a postcard in last month, or I guess it's still May, a couple weeks ago, just letting them know that those dumpsters are going to start getting swapped out. And then the website, which is where we're going to direct everyone to, it's going to have the most up-to-date information, everything about the contract transition and the service swaps, and everything is going to be on that waste management website, and it'll launch mid-June. And so the city is going to be working closely with waste management on social media and that kind of thing. And then we will be also doing a city bill insert next month to just let customers know the container swaps are going to start happening. And at the end of July is when the carts, so commercial carts and residential carts, will start getting swapped out. And in August is when waste management is actually going to launch the special phone number. So they'll help with customer service. Since it's a big transition, there'll be lots of questions. So their customer service will be online as well as ours in case people call either number. We also will have waste management will be at the August 8th farmers market, answering questions for any residents that are there. And then in September, there will be, at the end of September is when the Republic Services customers carts are going to be swapped, because waste management has to coordinate with Republic on that. And there's also, there will be some collection day changes coming. We're hoping to have the maps ready for the September magazine, but there will be letters that we'll mail to people to let them know if their collection day is changing. And then October 1st, the new contract starts, and brand new service packets will mail out right away with all the information that everyone needs. And in November is when customers will receive their first bill. So there's going to be a lot of information going out, but definitely we'll have a link on our city website to the Waste Management Auburn page. And we'll be providing outreach in many, many ways so that we can reach everybody and answer everyone's questions. Okay, back to the rate model. Other changes that happened that in this rate study that happened are part of our new contract and service changes. So we had a 10-gallon option. That option has been removed. It really was not heavily used, and the 10-gallon can was also problematic because it was little and the lid was not attached, and so it would disappear, it would roll away, just lots of issues with it. So in lieu of that, for those customers who really don't have a lot of waste and you compost their food in that, we did add a 35-gallon service option at one time a month. Those are for the people that are composting their food scraps, have a yard waste cart, and just really have very little garbage. Again, we added the 45-gallon option. Small compactors, like sizes 2 to 6 yards, they change from a monthly rate to a per haul rate. And then there will be, for people who need a second recycle cart, they can get up to a 96-gallon recycle cart for no cost. It's included in the rates, but if they need a second one, there is going to be a monthly rental fee. And then there is a new rate for event services. So periodically we have a group that wants to have carts. So now there's a fee for carts if they just want them for a short period of time. And then I did hold the extra garbage rate at $10.83. It's been that since before I arrived at the city. And so I don't think it needs to go any higher. So we're just keeping it at the $10.83. We always encourage people to have the right size that works for them. It provides a cleaner city when everyone can fit their garbage in and there's no bags sticking out and crows making a mess. So we also held the cart cleaning fee and the redelivery fee at $15. And one of the things I'm most excited about is that in addition to having our on-call bulky item collection, we did lower the rates. So when we did the proposal, we actually set the rates that the contractor had to agree to. So now, instead of someone who needs to pay a fee, like a multifamily complex, who someone moves out and they get stuck with a mattress or a refrigerator, instead of paying $121.35 for their refrigerator, they pay $35. And instead of paying $84.57 for a sofa, they pay $25. So hopefully that helps reduce some illegal dumping. It relieves some of those costs. I think it'll be a good thing. And then one more thing I don't have up here is we did have to correct a single family rate. The 35-gallon was actually lower than it should have been because if you ordered 2 35s, it was cheaper than 164 gallon and it should have been more. So there was a slight correction in that happened. So lots of factors going into this rate model. So this, you don't have to study this. This is just, I wanted to show you kind of all these numbers get put into this huge model and then this summary gets created for us. And so some of the numbers like 2021 look a little funky because it's modeling it after a full year and we're only proposing to increase the rates for a quarter. But this is where all the fund balance information is. This is where we can see the revenue surplus and shortfalls for each sector individually in dollar-wise and percentage-wise. So it gives us everything from this giant model. So now these rates, all the rates are on page 188 in your packet in the actual ordinance, but I just kind of wanted to give a high level overview of what the rates look like. So I always focus on the 35-gallon residential just because it affects most of our residents. So you're looking at, it's going to be a few dollars increase each year in this scenario. So right now they're paying $16.11, which is very, very low. And I think it's one of the lowest around. And it will go up to $19.75 October 1st if the rates are approved, and then $23 for 22 and $26.02 and 23. And that includes the recycle. So those just are kind of a sample to look at. And again, we're just trying to get these rates up to a portion that they're covering all the increased costs. So with that, we have the recommendation that council approves City Ordinance 6816 in order to keep our fund balance where it needs to be and continue providing great services to the customers of the city of Auburn. Questions?
Joan, thank you very much. And for all your years of working on this for the city. So you've done a tremendous job. Questions for Joan, Council?
Councilmember Baggett raised his hand.
Councilmember Baggett, go ahead.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you for that presentation. It was very informative. Number one, I guess I have a couple of questions, but number one, would we be able to get a copy of that presentation that you just made?
Yes, it is in the folder, so it'll be in the minutes.
Okay. The other thing is, are you still treating multifamily under the same rates as commercial?
Yes.
Okay. Now, will those people be entitled to a senior discount if they are over a certain age?
So we do have, it's different. So we have the senior discount for residents who own their own properties. We have the senior rebate for residents who are in a multifamily. So they do get a discount. It's just in a different format where they apply in the month of May for the previous year, and the city actually cuts a check to help cover those costs.
Yeah, we have several hundreds of people that live in mobile home parks and things of that nature. And I just want to make sure that they can anticipate what the next step would be for them. And I assume that that would be filing for a rebate, right?
Yes, yes. And we reach out to the property managers every year. We actually, people who have been part of it, we mail them a new application. And then we also put like ads in the senior magazine and things like that, trying to reach those people as any way we can.
Good. Thank you so much.
Councilmember Stearns.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I had a question about the rates. Can you, well, I don't know, it might be too much trouble, but I was just sort of trying to get a picture of, like, you know, for recycle and garbage, they're both the same. But like for, say, 35, 64, and 96, and then like the 4 current this October, next New Year's next year, and then New Year's the year after. The increases. So I'm just wondering, it sounds like the increases for the 35 gallon for residential, they would go up more than the others because you said they were too low. I'm wondering, just are the increases, it sounds like they're not all uniform. You know, like it's not like a 20 or a 80% increase for 35 and 80% or, you know, 60% for 64 and 60% for 96. It sounds like they're different. Am I right about that?
Yeah, so it depends. It's in that trying to keep the service sectors supporting themselves. And so while the overall increase, say out for October is say 13.6%, the residential increase on average is like 18%. It's higher, whereas commercial is 11%. It all depends on, you know, where those rates were at and making sure that they're covering their costs. So when we looked at, you know, the fund balance and whether there was a, you know, we just want to make sure each sector is covering its costs. So the percentage can be different among the different service sectors.
Yeah, because it looks like for the 35 gallon, if it's 1611, but it ends up at 2602. That's like a 62% increase.
Well, it's a 23% increase, and that's where I talked about how
that's for just October this year.
Yeah,
but it ends up on January 1st of 23 at a 62% increase.
Yeah, so it's a 23% increase in October, and then a 16% January 1, 22, and a 13% January 1, 2023.
Right, but if we were just to compare 2602 to 1611, that's 62%.
Yeah.
But the 64 gallon, it's definitely a lot lower.
Yeah, that initial correction that needed to happen. because the 35 gallon was lower than it really should have been in the
Right.
at the 1611, because if you look at 1611 times 2 is less than the 64 gallon of that 3560 where it was at. So we had to make that correction so that
Right. But the 96 gallon is up again higher.
yeah.
I mean, they're all just different. Anyway, I was just, okay, so for the 35 though, it's because it was too low historically.
Yes.
And for 60, I don't know, okay, I'll just leave it there. I might try to put together a chart to kind of help me out. Thanks.
It's a very complicated model, and there's a lot of factors that go into it. And yeah.
All right, thanks.
Councilmember J. Raj.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Joan, thank you for the presentation. My question is very simple. When you say senior citizens, what's the age range?
So our senior discount is for residents who are 62 and over or permanently disabled. And there is an income, we go on the HUD very low income requirement. So there's two factors, age and income, to be accepted for the discount.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Trout Manuel.
I had to laugh because that was my question. What do we consider a senior? What's the breakdown? But thank you for answering it. And what a great presentation. And it would be nice to get the slides of the last part of your presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Councilmember Brown.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Mayor. My question has to do with maybe unintended consequences. Could the council, and are you anticipating an impact on litter, or I don't know what the term probably is used, but using other people's garbage containers, that sort of theft of service, if you will. I mean, could we anticipate an impact in our community over these because of the increases that we're seeing here?
I mean, we have it right now, honestly, periodically. You know, we take, Waste Management takes pictures of any extras so that we can see and verify charges. And so it does periodically happen. And then we usually will contact the neighboring parties and try to just let them know that, it's a theft of service, make sure it's why we have mandatory service. So hopefully everyone is paying for their service. But I mean, it's always, it could happen, yes, but we also have to cover our costs.
And if I might, Deputy Mayor, we also are dealing with a littering problem or refuse problem that's contributed to by homelessness. And is there any service that we could anticipate to help the city with that?
I mean, the crews are mainly for, city right of way, and don't necessarily, they're not the ones who the city hires to go in and clean up camps necessarily. They're more taking care of the shopping carts that are left on the side of the road and the discarded clothing and other things that we find walking on the sidewalks. But yeah, they're not typically, from my knowledge, the city actually hires, contractors to go into the camps because there's so many other factors that have to be considered when those are cleaned up.
Thank you, Joan.
And if we recall, Director Tate gave us a range of costs that it would take to clean up the encampments, and we are into a very significant dollars overall. Councilmember Stearns, go ahead.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that point that Councilmember Brown made. Like in Tacoma, they have a purple bag program, so homeless people can, throw their trash out and it gets picked up. I'm just wondering, is that something that we would just continue to use the third-party contractor, or is that something that Waste Management does? I have no idea.
That would be something we'd probably have to work with the other departments if that was something the city wanted to do. But typically it's our litter crews. Like, so when we have the Adopt a Street program and the bags, we provide the bags, and then we coordinate with Amber's group and where the bags are left. It's the Waste Management litter crew or the city seasonal workers that go and pick those bags up. So if that was something that the city should want to do, it probably would be one of those crews that we will be picking those bags up.
Oh, great, thank you.
All right, Joan, once again, thank you very much. This has been a long time coming and a lot of hard work, and appreciate you being always involved and making great presentations to council.
Thank you.
All right, council. Now our last item on our agenda for council discussion is ordinance number 6822 with Director Thomas.
Hello again, council. I'm Jamie Thomas. I am bringing ordinance 6822 for your consideration. It is actually not a change so much as a correction that we had made the unintended error in one of a series of corrections that we've made to this code over the past year. So to give you some background history on this code, we're proposing to make an amendment to two sections of Auburn City Code. One is on the utility tax for the water and sewer services that the city provides. And the second amendment is to amend the utility tax language for the solid waste services provided by the city of Auburn. As you recall, back in 2020, we had made some revenue reallocations to help us shore up our general fund budget in anticipation of COVID impacts. So our code prior to 2020 assessed a total of 7% of a utility tax on water, sewer, and as well as garbage services. Of that 7%, 6% went to the general fund and 1% was dedicated specifically for the arterial street preservation program. But in 2020, we made an amendment to the code to pull about 1% that was dedicated to the arterial street preservation, and we pulled it into the general fund just for 1 year. It was to expire at the end of 2020, and then effective again January 1, 2021, that 1% would go back to arterial street preservation. So in the meantime, we had a 2021-2022 biennial budget discussion, and we had amended those same two code sections to increase our utility tax rate to a total of 10% for the water, sewer, and solid waste utilities. At the same time, we were using that as an opportunity to clean up the code section to make it a little bit easier to read. So it was worded consistently between the solid waste utility tax code and the water and sewer utility tax code. And in that process, we inadvertently forgot to send 1% back to the arterial street funds. So as the code reads currently, a total of 10% is being assessed on those city utilities, but it's all going to the general fund at this point. We would like to make the amendment to direct 1% of that total 10% back to the arterial streets fund, because that was the initial intention of that additional 1% from the very beginning. Was for arterial street preservation. So I also want to apologize that the original version of the ordinance that you'd received in your council packet was not the red line version. So that this is the ordinance that Sean had mentioned earlier that she sent to you, and that just includes the red line versions. And as you can see in the red line versions, that's us directing of the total 10%, 1% to arterial street funds. If our road index quality improves to the standard, then it also says that we would revert to a 9% total utility tax, and we would remove that 1%. I'm sure Ingrid would be ecstatic if our road quality index met those standards and we could remove the 1%. But in the meantime, that was the original intent prior to 2020, and we'd like to reinstate that. So with that, is there any questions that you have about our proposed changes?
Councilmember Stearns.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thanks, Jamie. So we weren't collecting, we were collecting all the money, but we weren't sending it to the
Correct.
appropriate account.
Correct. So the way
do we-
that we have our rates structured is that we those rates are embedded into our rates, that our water, sewer, and solid waste rates. And then we just essentially tax ourselves. So then we tax our own funds and we send the money to either the general fund, or in this case, it's been to the general fund. We want to reallocate everything that's been collected going back to January 1st, 2021 to the arterial street fund as we had originally intended.
Okay, yeah, that was my question. We can transfer the money that but we
Yes.
don't need to do that in the ordinance.
Correct. There's no back collection of taxes or anything like that. It's the money is already there. We just need to have the authority to pull it from the utility funds and send that 1% specifically to the arterial street preservation fund.
Okay, great, thanks.
Any other questions for Jamie, Council? All right, Jamie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, since we had our housing action plan briefing under the general discussion items, we have no other community wellness discussion items this evening. We have any other discussion items from council? Any new business? All right, everybody, have a great evening. We are adjourned and see you next time.
Good night.